Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our third episode in our weekly Stay Connected Facebook Live series. My name is Edna Friedberg, and I'm a historian at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Although our museum remains closed due to coronavirus, learning about the Holocaust does not have to stop during this period, so we are coming to you from our homes today. Every week, I've been thanking you for your patience if we encounter any technical problems, and this week is the technical problem. In fact, we've not been able to broadcast live today or stream live today, so the show you're watching is pre-recorded. We feel disappointed about that because we always like engaging with you in real time, but we hope you will still submit your questions, your comments later in the comments section to let us know where you're watching from, and we will post answers to as many of them as we can. Our guest today is my colleague and friend, collections curator, Kyra Schuster. Hi, Kyra.
Hi, Edna. Good morning. Thank you for having me.
It is nice to see you since I don't get to see you in person these days. Kyra is an acquisitions curator for the museum, which means that she works directly with families, with individuals who have objects, photographs, different elements of life from the Holocaust to donate to our collections, and we will be sharing some of these objects with you today in the course of our show. We are coming to you today on the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Bergen Belsen concentration camp. And over the course of several months in 1945, Allied troops uncovered horrifying evidence of mass atrocities when they liberated the last remaining Nazi camps. Today, we'll share with you some stories of resilience that illustrate how Holocaust survivors began to rebuild their shattered lives and how liberating troops dealt with the barbarity that they encountered. We hope that the stories, the personal stories we'll be sharing with you, will inspire, engage, and give you some sense of the human capacity for hope and optimism, even in the most difficult of circumstances. Kyra, let's begin by setting the scene for people who may be less familiar with the context for liberation. When Allied troops overran Nazi camps in 1945, what did they find?
Although they had heard rumors, the average GI was really unprepared for what he or she would encounter so soon after landing on European soil. They saw various evidence of systematic murder and other crimes. There were thousands upon thousands of corpses that lay unburied and piled up within the camps. Survivors were very emaciated and starving, and lice and disease was incredibly rampant throughout. In addition to wanting to properly bury the dead, the Allied troops also attempted to help and comfort the survivors by giving them food. In a lot of cases, their first instinct was just to, share their rations with them, which really was unhealthy for the survivors because they were so malnourished, their bodies weren't equipped to handle that much richness and calories at one time. And they also provided them with clothing and medical assistance once the hospital units were able to come in and provide that. The first camp liberated by the Americans was Ohrdruf, which was a subcamp of Buchenwald in Germany on April 4th, 1945. And what the GIs found there and saw is what prompted General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who is Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, to visit the camp and see this for himself.
For non-American visitors, GIs is the shorthand for your average enlisted soldier. You mentioned General Eisenhower, who was commander of all Allied troops and American military general, later President of the United States. Eisenhower was so profoundly disturbed by what he saw that he sent a cable back to Washington to his colleague, George C. Marshall, General Marshall, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so head of the coordinated American military. And here is what Eisenhower wrote to Marshall about what he saw. The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me sick. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda.
And this quote is really significant to us. I mean, we actually have it inscribed in the walls of the museum. So when everyone's able to come back and visit us here in Washington, D.C., they'll be able to see this on our walls.
Yeah, and the photograph that we just saw was actually of Eisenhower at Ohrdruf, looking at bodies, at dead bodies, surrounded by other troops. Eisenhower intuitively understood that crimes of this scale would be very difficult to comprehend, and he was quite immediately worried that in the future, with the passage of time, there would be a tendency to doubt or possibly even deny that they had taken place. How did he act on these concerns, Kyra?
So the photograph we just saw is one of many that Eisenhower himself ordered taken. Every unit that was nearby that was not on the front was expected to tour Ohrdruf to see this for themselves. And Eisenhower also urged members of Congress and journalists to come to the camp and to bear witness. Although American newspapers had reported on the discrimination and maltreatment of the Jews in Europe throughout the war, these images, which were being shared by the press, were really the first evidence that Americans saw of the realities of the concentration camps at the end of the war. A lot of newspapers, magazines, Time magazine, and in his newsreel footage, which ran in the movie theaters before a feature film, was how a lot of Americans learned about what had happened or saw it finally. And because of his leadership, reports and images about the horrors committed by the Nazis finally really gave American citizens made them aware of the full-scale horror of the Holocaust.
And I think that it's easy for us to forget now, when we have seen so many of these, just how shocking they would have been at the time. These pictures of starving people, of piles of corpses. But many of these were taken in a systematic way by members of the U.S. Army Signal Corps, photographers, still photographers and moving picture photographers who were quite literally embedded in military units that were liberating camps. Can you tell us a little bit more about these photos and other ones that we have in our collections that you've seen over the years?
I would say that these photographs in the camps after liberation are probably the #1 item we get called about in the curator's office practically on a daily basis. These photos, especially the Signal Corps images, were very widely copied and shared and printed amongst the soldiers. So everyone seemed to have a copy. They were sending them in letters home to their families so their families could bear witness. You also had soldiers who were all standing around, those who had cameras, their own personal cameras, taking images of these scenes and sharing them amongst each other and also with their family. Now, sadly, as we're losing our veterans and the eyewitnesses from that generation, their families are finding these materials and then contacting us about them. And we're happy to take a look. Every photo has a different piece of information. It could be the inscription on the back. It could be the letter that it was sent home with, or additional testimony from the soldiers. But these images, I think people would be surprised at how widely shared these images actually became.
I think that's a good reminder and a chance to us to make a call to people who may be watching to know that the museum still actively collects materials of all kinds from veterans, not only from survivor families, but from anyone who was alive during the time or has materials that are direct, authentic primary sources from that period. So feel free to please be in touch with us if you are finding things in your dresser drawers, in your attics. We've been talking more about liberators the last few minutes, but I'd like to turn to stories of survivors themselves, Kyra. Liberation is such an optimistic sounding word, and we would be totally off base if we implied that it was some kind of happy ending for people who had been through hell. What were some of the immediate challenges that faced survivors right after they were freed?
Well, I think a good person to share an example of this is a Holocaust survivor, a woman who we have the honor of volunteering, who volunteers for us at the museum, Estelle Flynn. What she and her mother and sister went through really illustrate kind of this reality of what happened after liberation. To go back a little bit, Estelle was born in Warsaw, Poland, and within months of the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, Estelle, who was only 10 years old at the time, along with her family and about 400,000 other Jews, were moved into the Warsaw Ghetto. And after the Germans deported a majority of the Jews from the ghetto in the summer of 1942, Estelle and her family went into hiding. Unfortunately, they were discovered in a bunker after the Germans had bombed the ghetto and were sent to the Majdanek death camp and killing center, where sadly Estelle's father was murdered. But Estelle, her mother, and her sister were not killed. They were actually chosen for forced labor. So they, as forced laborers, they were made to work in these factories for the German war effort. It was very much against their will. And they were there for a few years, and it wasn't until January 1945, Estelle was in the factory and heard planes overhead. She was, at that time, they were in Częstochowa, Poland. And she said, quote, "I assure you that liberation was not anything like you are likely to imagine." She was only 15 at the time, and so they came out of the factory. She has, it's the middle of winter, no stockings, no socks. It was really kind of a frozen no man's land, and they were very much terrified that this was just, all of this noise was kind of a ruse to lure them out of the factory, and that something terrible would happen to them once they went outside. But when they did go outside, the women heard the voices of Soviet soldiers who greeted them. But the Soviets themselves still had a war to fight. So they really kind of left these women to their own devices to wander on their own and figure out what to do next. And, there was not food waiting for them or medical attention or anything like that. So, Estelle really kind of took things into her own. She broke into a nearby pickle factory to forage for her first meal after the war with whatever she could find. And she said, we didn't have a penny in our pockets. We had no home to go back to. We had no country to go back to. And there was still a lot of anti-Semitism and physical hostilities still taking place in Poland.
I think your point about the Soviet soldiers kind of incidentally liberating them on the way is a really important reminder to us that liberation took place as part of the overall course of the war, and that it was a process, not an event. Estelle is liberated in the dead of winter, and the other camps that we're talking about are liberated later that spring in 1945. So it's not like one day the war is over simultaneously for everyone.
Yeah, there is no real standard liberation story, as you said. For Estelle and her mother and her sister, they just kept walking until they finally arrived at a train station. But even once they arrived there, they were assaulted by young students who were nearby, who were literally throwing stones at them and put their dogs on them and were yelling at them. And of course, parents are standing by watching, saying nothing. But there was one woman who stepped out of her home and saw what was taking place and took action. And she placed herself between Estelle and her family and these kids and told them to stop, ordered them to stop, which they did, and then took in Estelle and her family for the night and really took action, which was pretty bold for her at the time, for this woman to protect them.
Yeah, that woman was actually putting herself at risk by going against the crowd and saying, I'm going to protect these total strangers because it is the human and right thing to do.
Absolutely.
It's hard to think about just how vulnerable Estelle, her mother, her sister, and hundreds of thousands of other survivors would have felt in that moment in time.
Yeah, and Estelle later reflected on her whole experience. She said, "It's amazing how much suffering a human being can endure and still remain human." And I think that says a lot about her and who she is and what she went through. Her family continued to search for a safe place to live after they were liberated. They ended up moving to Bavaria in August 1945 in order to escape the violent anti-Semitism that was taking place in Poland. And they were stateless. They had no home, no country to call their own at that point. Eventually, the three of them immigrated to the United States in 1947. And as I mentioned, she is now a volunteer at the Holocaust Museum here in Washington, D.C. with us. And I believe we'll be sharing a link in our comments section where you can watch Estelle give her testimony and her firsthand account of her experiences.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that when people watch that, and I encourage you to watch Estelle Laughlin's first-person testimony of her experience, you will be struck by how she's actually a really joyful person. And I think it's really kind of dazzling and motivating to see that someone can go through really the depths of hell and still feel like there is life worth living, and that there is an essential humanity in most of us that makes you want to embrace the future.
Yeah, I will never cease to be amazed by the survivors who volunteer with us that we get to work with on a daily basis. Not only the work that they do for us, but to our public, and telling their stories and about their Holocaust experiences over and over in order to educate others. It's truly amazing, and they're wonderful people to get to know and to work with.
In addition to hearing from survivors, liberators, we also have many, many thousands of objects in our collections that are silent witnesses that tell stories themselves. Let's turn to one of those, Kyra, and to the story of an American liberator, a man named Francis Fife. Tell us about what he did and what objects, very, very special objects we have.
So Francis was a member of the 4th Infantry Division, and on D-Day, which was June 6, 1944, his division was one of the first to land on Utah Beach during the Battle of the Bulge. And it was during their march into southern Germany that the 4th Infantry Division discovered the site of a Dachau subcamp near Hohenstetten, which was one of the biggest subcamps in Nazi Germany because it was built to service Messerschmitt aircraft plant. And as his unit was coming up on this factory, they threw the doors open. There was an unknown survivor who literally just tossed a bouquet of paper flowers to Francis, which he caught. The flowers were made from German stationery. And this unknown survivor threw these to Francis and just kept running. Francis remarked later he never knew who made them, who gave them, what happened to them. As you can see here, here's a photo, his army portrait of Francis and also the flowers themselves. After he returned home, Francis placed these in a vase on his desk where they remained until he died. And it wasn't until his wife, Nancy O'Brien, was spring cleaning one day and saw these flowers, which as you can see are very fragile. They're very dried out and brittle from having sat on his desk all these years. And Nancy had asked him, can we just throw these away? I mean, they're in terrible condition. And it wasn't until she made that comment that Francis then explained to her what the significance of them was. So after Francis passed away and the family was going through their papers, and Francis and his wife were both former mayors of Charlottesville, Virginia. So they were preparing to donate his papers to the University of Virginia relating to his local political career. But they all agreed that the flowers should be donated to the Holocaust Museum so that they can be physically preserved, but also so that the story behind them and Francis's experiences as a liberator, that information would also be able to be preserved. And I had the pleasure of meeting with the O'Brien and Fife family. All the children and grandchildren and Nancy O'Brien came to the museum to donate this collection, which meant so much to them. And it is now our honor and our privilege to be able to tell his story as well and to preserve these precious flowers, which are so incredibly fragile. They will never be able to go on physical display. So I'm glad that we're able to share them with you in a digital format this morning.
And if we can take a look at them again, they're just so extraordinary. Even though I've worked at the Holocaust Museum for over 20 years, I had never seen them before. And you had mentioned that they're made, if people look closely at some of the petals, you can see writing and boxes. They're made from administrative forms. So the idea that some unknown survivor had the presence of mind, the creative inspiration to say, I'm going to take papers that very well are part of my oppression and turn them into something beautiful and something that is an expression of gratitude and human connection for a man who fought for my freedom. It's lump in the throat kind of thing. And you can, as you said, they are falling apart. They're crumbling right here. So really, really glad to be able to look at them and to know that the emotional resonance they had for Francis Fife, that he kept them on his desk for all those years without talking about it, but they were a reminder to him of this seminal event in his life.
Yeah, a lot of the liberators never really spoke about what they experienced, so their families are only learning their stories later in life or after they pass when they find this material.
Yeah. Let's turn now to some stories a little bit later post-liberation that demonstrate many survivors' will to recover and rebuild after the Holocaust. And let's do that by taking a look at what was happening in displaced persons camps, often known as DP camps, that were administered by the Allies in occupied zones of Germany. As you had mentioned when you were talking about Estelle and her family, many Jewish survivors were afraid to return home, either because of the threat of violence or hatred of Jews in their hometowns, or simply because it was too traumatic to go back to a place where perhaps their entire families had been murdered. Tell us a little bit about these DP camps.
So as we mentioned, the war did not end at liberation. For a lot of people, the trauma did not end. So From 1945 until 1952, there were more than 250,000 Jewish displaced persons who found refuge in camps and urban centers throughout Germany, Austria, and Italy. There were many attempts to locate family members who may have also survived, a lot of creation of new families. So immediately after the Holocaust, there was a large wave of marriages and then pregnancies and births, making the birth rate in the DP camps one of the highest in the world at that time. Historians later described this as an effort to bring life into the world as, kind of a form of revenge against the death and destruction caused by the war. I think you could also call it the ultimate act of faith or optimism, this renewal of life and wanting to start over and fresh. But also that I love that people were able to find love with each other and start these families. I think that's a really beautiful and hopeful thing.
I've just been seeing a photograph now of some women in these DP camps pushing a quite literal parade of carriages of these new families that they were creating in the absence of the families that they had been robbed of during the Holocaust. Can you give us a sense of scale of this?
Yeah, so in January 1946, in the American occupied zone in Germany, so you had the British controlled zone, the Soviet controlled zone, the American zone. So in the American controlled occupied zone in Germany, there were 120 children under the age of 5 in January 1946. About 9 months later, by September of that year, though, the number had reached 4,430. So quite an increase in new families that were started and children that were born during that time.
It's hard to fathom just how many diapers there must have been needed. The amount
Parade of Strollers.
Yeah. I know that I have encountered, and I know for sure you have too, many people who were born in these DP camps or whose parents met in DP camps, but who perhaps were never told by their parents, only discovered very late in life that their parents, in fact, had been married before, had children before, who were murdered during the Holocaust. And they just had to take this intense, unimaginable, deep wound and put it aside in order to start again, and not talking about it was one way that they could do it. But that's quite a secret to keep.
Yeah, and as people discover, some people knew about these first families, others maybe only had a name or scant information. And so the museum is contacted by quite a few people on a regular basis asking for assistance to help do that research, to discover more about who these people were, what their names were, to not only remember them, give them a proper remembrance, put full names, maybe they only knew a first name or a town, just so they can learn a little bit more about their family history.
Yeah, incredible layers and complicated emotions there.
Yeah.
Other forms of rebuilding took place in these DP camps, if you can tell us briefly.
So schools were established. You had teachers that were coming in from the Jewish community in Palestine in the United States in order to teach the displaced persons, not just, math and language and things like that, but also practical skills, technical skills that they could use then for future careers once they were able to immigrate or start their lives over outside of the displaced persons camps. Religious practices emerged, so Orthodox Judaism began a huge rebirth with religious schools that were created. You had holidays and celebrations that were once again being observed. And a lot of efforts were made to create very vibrant social and cultural experiences. So you had theater and musical groups that were comprised of DPs who were then doing tours of DP camps. Athletic clubs, competitions from DP camps competing against each other. Journalism flourished. There were more than 170 publications, newspapers, magazines, books that were written. And a lot of these newspapers also, they were using them as opportunities to try to find their family by placing ads, looking for people. So very few options or doors open to them. A lot of these survivors were hoping that they could ultimately immigrate to Palestine. And a lot of them became very strong advocates for the recognition of a formal Jewish state. So there were a lot of protests and demands and insistence and attempts to immigrate as well.
And during these years, for people who be less familiar with the history of the region, Palestine was in its final years of a British mandate, British control which strictly limited the number of people who could emigrate there. And in fact, lest we give the false impression that all of these people were just delighted to be living in displaced persons camps, as we had mentioned earlier. These are stateless people, they are traumatized people, and most of the immigration restrictions that had made it close to impossible for them to find refuge before and during the Holocaust were still in place in the immediate aftermath of the war. So these people were stranded with close to nowhere to go. I can say that just speaking personally, I know that it wasn't until 1948 that my own father, who was a survivor, was allowed to enter the United States due to the passage of new legislation, but he remained in post-war Poland for several years and France after, just waiting for a visa to come through, even though he had relatives who were more than happy to sponsor him. So this was a period of limbo. In the last few minutes that we have for this show, let's turn though to talk about one of these DP camp romances, a couple, Lily and Ludwig Friedman, and some materials in our collection.
So Lily Lax and her two sisters all had been liberated from Bergen Belsen. They had typhus, and so they were taken to recuperate in a hospital in the nearby town of Celle. And one day when Lily was collecting her food rations at the Bergen Belsen DP camp, she met a fellow survivor from Czechoslovakia named Ludwig Friedman. They fell in love, they became engaged, and Ludwig had promised Lily that he would find fabric for her so she could have a white wedding gown. So he purchased an old silk parachute from a German soldier in the area, and Lily hired a seamstress to make a dress in exchange for her cigarette rations. So she bartered for this woman's skills. And so ultimately, out of that parachute came Lily's wedding dress, along with Ludwig's shirt and a pair of gloves that were made all from the same parachute. Lily was 22 years old and Ludwig was 21, and they were married at a synagogue in Celle in January 1946. And then in 1948, they immigrated to the United States.
We've just seen their formal wedding portrait right now.
Yeah.
Her veil, her gown, which seems to have a long trail, a long train, and his shirt, quite elegant. I'm struck by the fact that he's wearing a ring, she's wearing a necklace, and people did not have much. So jewelry was certainly passed around and shared for these happy occasions. And Lily wasn't the only bride to wear this special parachute wedding gown. Can you tell us about how this gown spoke to a sense of community in the Bergen Belsen DP camp?
So Lily's sister, and her cousin Rosie Silverstein were later married in the same gown, and Lily continued to lend it out. She actually stopped counting at 17 other brides from Celle and the Belsen DP camps who wore the dress. So maybe one day we'll be able to have names and photos from all of the other brides who wore. Here you see a photo of Jolie Joseph and Gerhard Kohn in their wedding in the Belsen DP camp, also wearing the same dress. And we actually have the wedding dress in our collection now, along with the gloves and blouse and train and veil, all of it, which is currently located out at the museum's Chappelle Family Collections and Conservation Center. We've lent the dress out to the Bergen Belsen Memorial for their exhibitions, and you can view it on our website and see these photos as well in our online collections catalog. Here you can see a close-up of the detail that went into, this hand sewing of this dress, as well as the gloves themselves, which the brides wore.
And again, just looking at these gloves with the kind of pearly buttons, the stitch work, the needlepoint work on the dress, I'm just struck that these are people who are, not having even necessarily reliable sources of food, are incredibly traumatized, but are able to channel creativity and hope into making something beautiful and something optimistic to celebrate these new beginnings. So really very, very special, and it is our privilege here at the museum. We are very grateful to have these items donated to us and that we are the stewards of them in perpetuity. So, Kyra, I want to thank you very, very much. I know that you are full to the brim with stories like these, and we could talk for hours about it, but I hope that this tempts people to explore more on our website. So thank you, Kyra, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me today.
I also want to thank the audience. We are sorry we are not live with you today. That is one of our favorite things, but we hope that you enjoyed learning about some of the challenges that were faced by survivors, rebuilding their lives after liberation and their interactions with some of the soldiers who freed them. Today, we shared stories of resilience, of starting over, despite deep wounds, both physical and emotional, and how survivors like Estelle Flynn, like Lily and Ludwig Friedman, even managed to find joy after the trauma of the Holocaust. We hope you will join us next week. This is a season of anniversaries, and next week we will be observing the National Days of Remembrance, the United States annual commemoration of the Holocaust. Please tune in on Facebook next Tuesday, April 21st at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, where we will have a very special ceremony. We usually have this ceremony in person in the United States Capitol building, but because of the coronavirus restrictions, we will be doing it virtually this year. We hope you will join us, and we are very, very glad to be connected with you as part of a global community marking 75 years since the dramatic events of spring 1945 that marked the end of the crimes of the Holocaust and the challenges in the aftermath and of rebuilding. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.